So I have give this talk to my college students, a version of it, and I've given this talk to lots of different groups of all ages, and I often use the term the Sacramento floodscape, and as far as I know, I made up that word. It's my word. I'm going to copyright it. If you ever use it in a sentence, you owe me a nickel each time because it's my word. What does it mean? It's a landscape dominated by flooding, by the threat of flooding, by efforts to prevent flooding. And whether you know it or not, if you drive around the greater Sacramento area, Davis, Woodland, Winters, flooding is kind of an ever-present issue, even on a quiet day. Our lives are actually really impacted by potential flooding, the threat of flooding. So let me go ahead and continue to make my point. I'm going to try to find, I'm going to try to find my laser pointer so it's a little bit easier to see. Can people see the red dot?
Yeah.
Can you see? Yeah? Okay, super, thank you. I pulled up a map and I recently just took a look at the news to see where flooding was happening in the world. And just within the last month or two, in fact, a few months ago, there was a huge flooding issue in Michigan. Sudan is having significant flooding problems right now, lots of farmland being flooded, people being displaced. I saw reports of flooding in Afghanistan, reports of flooding in Bangladesh and India. Right now, actually, as we speak, there's Tropical Storm Beta, which is causing flooding along the Texas coast. And that's just a few of them. So what are our goals here? We're going to talk about specifically our home, our region. Why does it flood? Why did people settle here in the first place? That's a really good question. How do we cope with flooding? Like what do we do to deal with it? And what does our future hold? And I really try to be an optimist. These are challenging times for a lot of reasons, but humans are pretty clever. Humans are pretty creative. And so have faith that you guys will soak this in and maybe even yourselves come up with solutions that we haven't even thought of. So why does it flood here in the greater Sacramento area, including Davis? So hopefully everybody recognizes where this is, California. And you see this huge mountain range. This has a lot to do, even though we don't live up in the Sierra, we live right adjacent to it down here in the Central Valley of California. And the basics of the science behind rainfall and snowfall has a lot to do with this big giant mountain barrier. The Sierra at their tallest are over 14,000 feet tall. And a lot of let me go backward for a second, a lot of our air comes off of the Pacific Ocean. It comes moving off of the Pacific Ocean and it crashes into the Sierra and it lifts upward. And that process causes cooling, causes cloud formation, causes precipitation. And so that's just kind of a normal thing, especially during winter for us. And so one of the things that can happen is if it rains for a long time, like these winter storms that are pretty cold, but they're dropping hours and days of rain, then what happens is the ground gets saturated like a sponge and it just fills up and then more rain can't soak in. There's no room for it to soak in. That's pretty common. That doesn't really create massive hassles, but it creates problems in local areas. Also note that they show some snow up here. Of course, we get snow in the mountains, and during the cold storms, a lot of that precipitation falls as snow, and it just sits there. It doesn't go anywhere. But of course, in the spring, when things warm up, that snow can really melt. So that's another way that we can get flooding is when you have lots of snow and it really starts to melt. So there's lots of cold rain on saturated ground. That's one. Snow melt in the spring, that's two. And then the biggie is what we refer to as an atmospheric river. And that is basically a giant plume of moisture, of humidity, water vapor, basically the ingredients for rain and snow, especially when it's warm, when it comes from the tropics. Few people know this, but we can literally get our water vapor, our ingredients for precipitation, all the way from Hawaii, all the way from the Philippines, all the way from Southeast Asia. And if it's warm enough, and if it suddenly rains on top of snow, well, that's a really big game changer. That can cut loose massive amounts of water in a very short time. And that's really our biggest worry. Now, I'm going to experiment with something here real quick. Let me see if it'll let me click. It doesn't seem to be. Let's see. I'm going to try to turn off my laser pointer. I'm going to see if it brings up. So can you see this image of Earth? Okay. So this is one of my favorites. This is live right now. Satellites.
Sorry, it's showing us the slide. It didn't open and it didn't share the new window.
Okay, let me see if I can get it to share the new window. Did it now?
We see it now.
Okay. On mine, it lets me show everything. And so I think I just have to toggle back and forth when I'm doing this. So just speak up and interrupt me. So this is a live image, satellite derived. Satellites can pick up where the water vapor is. It has a heat signature. So the light blue is lots and lots of water moving through the air. So we just talked about Tropical Storm Beta. This is basically a giant vacuum sucking up a lot of this water vapor off the Gulf of Mexico. Of course, what do you see over here? This is Hurricane Teddy right now, which is dragging lots of water vapor, and it's going to probably cause quite a bit of flooding up in Nova Scotia. It's really interesting to know that this is happening all the time, but the thing that really worries us is if we have one of these blue things slam into California in the middle of winter when we have lots of rain, lots of snow in the mountains. That's what really kind of worries us. So let me go back to my slide. And I'm back to the original slide. Yeah.
We're having a request for the link to the live view to go into the chat. I can look for it while.
Yeah, actually, I will. It's yeah. I will. Let me find it here. Sure, because it's a pretty cool thing, and this website lets you do a lot of different things.
I believe we looked at air patterns at one point, but this is a different. It has different layers that you can ask it to show you.
So this should be one version of it that I just dropped in the chat. Okay, and you can change all the settings. So when that happens, as I said, it can really cut loose a lot of water that starts flowing down the mountains. This happened back in 1997. Not the only time, but it was a very big event. And I drove up to the mountains because I wanted to see what was happening. And so what you're going to see are some spots along the American River. This is the same river where gold was discovered. And then I went back 3 or 4 months later when the water had significantly reduced to retake the same photos so that you get an idea of lots of water versus only a little bit of water. This was approximately 1/4 of the Mississippi River, which is a crazy thought because the Mississippi River is a massive river. And suddenly on this random day in the Sierra Nevada, there was about 25% of the entire Mississippi River. So here's during, there's after. And I'll just blow through some of these. There's a number of different images during, after, after. This bridge was rumbling. I saw a small building float by. I mean, it was really a pretty serious deal. So the deal is, up in the mountains, the canyons are really narrow, so the water doesn't go very far. But what happens when it spills out onto the flatlands, that's the bigger story here. Is we live in what is called a floodplain, and there's probably a more technical definition. I often hate technical definitions. I like simple definitions. It's the flat area next to the river that periodically floods. And our rivers, very much, when rivers are flat, they begin to behave like this. This is called a meandering river. Sometimes they jump their banks. Sometimes they abandon chunks of the river, creating these lakes called oxbow lakes. And so this is very much what it looks like on a dry day, even around here. But when that water comes flying out of the mountains, it's got tons of sediment in it. And then periodically, or over time, that sediment will settle out and it will deposit. So you see there in my little animation, it deposits along the ground, and that's what creates our soils. That's obviously a big deal in the Central Valley. It's a big part of our economy. We are a world-class agricultural region, and it turns out it's because of the rivers depositing all that dirt. So during that big flood, I got a chance to go up and go flying. I just lucked out and was in somebody's office, and they said, "Do you want to go take a plane ride?" And I said, "Of course I do." And I got to see the floodplain filled with water. You can see a little bit of the pattern of where the river is. So you can see it over here. You can see it here. And this was, again, a very big flood event. It did not, fortunately, flood a lot of people's homes, but it did do a lot of damage and upset a lot of people. That's kind of a lonely day out there at that house. So there's a good question, is if this is what goes on periodically, why would people ever come here in the first place? And let me be clear, the Native Americans who were here for thousands of years prior to other European settlers from Asia, they did not build their permanent structures in the floodplain. They visited the floodplain to get fish, to collect acorns, but they did not put permanent settlements there. Many of you are familiar with Sutter's Fort, John Sutter, and the fort was built actually up on a hill. So the fort didn't get flooded that much, but there are actually stories of people visiting the fort in a raft, in a boat, which is a funny thought. Many of you probably went there, I think, in 4th grade. Did anybody go on a boat? I don't think anybody went on a boat, probably not. But when the gold rush hit California, and that, of course, attracted all sorts of attention, of course, I'm skipping a lot, but people began to settle here. And this one picture really explains why. In fact, I want you to think for a second. And I'm going to take a peek in the chat. This picture that I'm showing you explains kind of two basic reasons that made our part of the world super attractive to settlement. So I'm going to look at the chat and see if anybody chimes in and tells me what you think this old postcard is showing us that indicates why people would have come here. Okay, so yeah, I'm seeing fertile as in fertile soils, trade. How do you trade in money, farming? How do you trade? Well, yeah, I'm seeing lots of water, good soil. Yeah, absolutely, those are excellent. The farmland is the one big one, and I told you that we have great soils because of flooding. It's kind of ironic. And then the river is the other one. You see this riverboat. What did this riverboat allow for? It allowed for transportation. Roads were terrible in the late 1800s, early 1900s. But riverboats were an easy way to get from San Francisco to Sacramento. And you see right down here, this little dock has a red flag. The red flag means, hey, come pick up my stuff. I want to go sell it in the big city. So yeah, there's a lot going on here. Let me see here. Okay. Okay. So this is a lithograph, an old etching of Sacramento, and it kind of reinforces this point. Would you? I don't know if anybody ever goes shopping and goes and gets groceries. Maybe you help your parents. Does anybody ever park like 20 blocks from your house and carry your groceries 20 blocks? People don't do that. It's not normal. You want to park close to where you live. And so as you can see here, people lived near the river because they wanted to have close access to the river, which is great. And I already said the farming was great. And we built canals and we really felt like we had a lot of control, until you don't have control. So you see this etching here. This is Old Town Sacramento, and it looked like this numerous times. I mean, there's a really lengthy history of flood after flood after flood. Here's another one, boats right down the middle of the street in Old Sacramento. So again, that begs the question, why stay? Why would we stay? And I don't actually have a great answer. There were times when people said, maybe we should give up because we're sick of getting flooded. And they didn't. They stayed because it was attractive for many other reasons. Then the question is, how do we cope with it? What have we done over time? And what have we done that maybe wasn't the wisest thing to do? So I lump all these solutions into kind of two categories. So the first category I just call fighting the floodwater. And what I mean here is people are building structures to hold back or divert the water, to send it somewhere else, or to just hold it back. So you're familiar with a lot of these dams, and we'll talk more about these because some of these I want to discuss some healthy criticism. These are incredibly effective, and some of them are also have serious downsides. Levees. Okay, a levee is just a long hill, like a wall of dirt basically, and it keeps the water on one side so you can do whatever you want on the other side. A weir and a bypass, we'll talk more about those. That's a diversion, a pretty smart thing actually. Movable barriers. This to me seems so incredibly old-fashioned, but our emergency plans, especially for Sacramento, involve lots of these, calling up people and saying, hey, shut the gates because we're worried about floodwaters. Emergency pumps. There are many around the greater Sacramento area, and there are even some in Davis. So let me go back to dams, just briefly. Again, they're incredibly effective. This is Folsom Dam, and this has saved Sacramento many times since it was built in the 50s. But people sometimes don't recognize the downside. So there are many benefits. There are also some significant problems. You see this Folsom Lake, again, that's a lot of great water for us to use, but it flooded lots of habitat. It also blocked fish migration. So it has really done some damage, if you're being honest, to the environment. One of the biggest concerns, honestly, is that when they work, that's great. When they don't, when they fail, that can be disastrous. And I just want to say this really came up and was a concern very recently. I'm sure people remember this. Up along the Feather River, there was a dam called Oroville Dam in Lake Oroville. And there was lots and lots of rain, and it was filling up. And it has this spillway, which is commonly used. You open up these gates to empty the dam. You don't want the dam to get too full. Well, the spillway had some problems. It basically broke. And so they used this emergency spillway. And everybody thought, oh, that's fine. They hadn't used it in years. And here's what happened. It started to erode all of the dirt. It was carrying away, huge chunks of land. And right along here, so this is the spillway in action, they began to realize and worry that the water spilling over the top of this wall. So here's this little wall. If I go back, it's this wall right here. The water spilling over the top was possibly going to spill and erode underneath and cause the wall to fall. Well, that would have cut loose millions of gallons of water, not the whole dam. So let me be clear. Nobody was saying that the dam itself was going to break. They were saying that this wall was going to break. And that would have been enough to put a lot of people underwater. And, there was a giant evacuation. 80,000 people were evacuated. It was a very big deal. And we don't want that to happen. So obviously we put some money into this and we take care about this, but the threat is always there. The worry is always there. So I want you to understand that dams and reservoirs have great benefits. They also have some potential problems. Same thing with levees. Levees are really effective. We have hundreds of miles of levees, and here's a levee doing its job. Water on one side, dry on the other side. But what a lot of people don't know is if you're building them correctly, if you're putting effort into what you're doing and doing it right, they're very complex. It's not just a mound of dirt. Um, they are, to do right, it costs over $1 million a mile to build one of these, which is a crazy thought when I learned that. And they pack them with different types of dirt. And many of them, again, the ones, if you have a levee and it's protecting your home or your business or your farm, you really want it to be the best. They have like a concrete wall down the middle. They literally bury a concrete wall down the middle of this so that the water can't leak through, because that's the biggest problem. People are worried about the water leaking underneath and causing the whole thing to crumble. So this is an image. I'm going to move my little controls here. So Sacramento's way down here. Davis would be right about where my little red dot is. Woodland is just north of there. So all of that pinkish color, I don't know if we have anybody who's a color expert. I think it's pinkish or fuchsia or something, or chartreuse, I don't know. All of those are levees that hold back and protect homes and farms and cities and businesses. So all it takes is for one levee to break. That's kind of the problem. So here, these are levees along the Sacramento River. If people have ever heard of, this is West Sacramento over here. The River Cat Stadium is kind of over here. These homes on the other side are the Garden Highway. So if anybody knows the Garden Highway, there's a lot of times people go to a restaurant called Chevy's on the Water. It's along here. So here is one of these, and they've got really good levees. Here's a normal day. Here's a little bit more water, and here's lots of water. This is filled to the gills. And it's great when they work well, but again, this puts a lot of stress on them. So let's look at here's more out toward the Delta, so you can see levees in action, doing their job, working, like they're supposed to. And we built, again, miles and miles of them so that we could do all this farming. But one of the things is, do you see the windy nature of this? I already mentioned it's called a meandering river. Naturally speaking, over time, rivers don't want to stay in one place. When there's no humans around, that's not going to stay in one place for more than a few years. It's going to evolve. It's going to change over decades or hundreds of years or thousands of years. That's just nature, and it's absolutely fascinating. Of course, we don't want nature to happen to us. We want to be in control of nature so that we can predict where to put our farms. Here's a map showing these little lakes. This is only about 20 or 30-minute drive from Davis. So these little lakes are absolute evidence that this river has changed and wants to change course, but we don't want it to. Here's a satellite image showing all the farmland around there. Well, the farmers don't want the river to change course. They want it to stay put. Rivers like this don't want to stay put. Let me also show you that not only, we talked about the floodplain. The floodplain, naturally speaking, as a natural habitat, is filled with lots of marsh-type vegetation, tules and reeds. It's also filled with what's called riparian forest. So there are these thick, giant forests right along the river. And what we've really done is we've also, part of the problem with levees is that we have destroyed a lot of this natural native habitat. There's not much left, and that's a little bit sad. We did have options. There were other ideas that people chose not to do. So here is, again, this type of wetland habitat. We used to have hundreds of thousands of square miles of this type of habitat, and it was habitat for waterfowl and all kinds of wildlife. The Central Valley used to look like this, especially in winter, where you could hardly see the sky, you could hardly see the sun. The red here, this is kind of an old map, but the red is wetland habitat. So this is about 120 years ago, and you can see this is about 30 years ago, which is close to now. Most of that wetland habitat, excuse me, I got a little tickle in my throat. Most of that wetland habitat is gone. Why? Because we put levees and we turned it all into farmland. We turned it all into cities. And so we've really lost some of that nature that used to be here. So I'm going to give you kind of an alternative of a choice we could have made and that we can still make. I also just want to show you a few more shots of levees. So again, here's a levee. It's working really well. Everything's going great. It's sending the water where it needs to go. This is a map actually showing a survey of levees in our area. They took a careful look at them to determine what their condition was. And this is a few years ago. A lot of these have been fixed. But do you see this purple? The purple is a high concern levee. Do you see how much purple we have in our area? We have a lot of purple. Those are levees that we're worried about. So when you have to rely on this for your livelihood and protecting your homes and your businesses and your farms, that's definitely a concern. And levees break. They simply break. Here's when I went flying, I got to see a lot of these. Here's another levee that broke, and I'll bring this up in another example. This was south of the Sacramento-Davis area. This was north of the Sacramento-Davis area. And as good a condition as they might look, they still periodically break, and then it cuts loose with all kinds of water everywhere. To me, a hugely ironic aspect of this is that when one levee breaks, and you see all this flooding. So here's a creek. This is down towards Stockton and Modesto. You see this is a creek that flooded and the levees broke, and now water's everywhere. Well, it turns out that the levees now work really well to hold the water on the flooded land. So when you build a really good levee, it ends up causing you problems because the water can't gently flow back into the river. It basically holds the water in your home. It holds the water on your farm, which is, nobody wanted that to happen, but turns out that's what happened. So here's my second solution. Instead of fighting it, you can just get out of the way. So you're going to say, well, look, it's going to flood. We're going to live our lives differently. We're going to behave differently. So what does that mean? Don't put houses and businesses where we know it's going to flood. This is called land use. People get together and they make decisions about what to do with the land, where to put your homes, where to put your businesses. And I would say it's pretty smart to not put homes and businesses and schools and hospitals in risky areas, although people do. Instead, what could you do? Set it aside for farmland, okay? So we do that a lot. It's not a great day for the farmers when they lose their crops to flooding, but they can buy insurance. And flooding a cornfield is different than flooding a school or a hospital or your home. Here is, this is from anybody who ever goes to Sacramento, this is called the Yolo Bypass. So there's a dry day, there's a little bit of water, and I'll show you filled up. Set it aside for wildlife. Here's another great idea. There's plenty of, I already showed you, there's plenty of animals and waterfowl that thrive with this type of environment. So set it aside so that we can preserve habitat. Set it aside for parks. This is Discovery Park in Sacramento, which will periodically flood. And again, it's not a great day when this happens. It causes some problems, but it's also, again, not flooding homes, not flooding businesses. And so, what should you do on a day like this? Cancel your picnic or stand on a dry spot and watch the river. So it's not like it inconveniences people like a complete flood does that shuts down roads and businesses and so forth. So another aspect of getting out of the way is if you are going to build in a flood zone, build differently. This is Interstate 80. It's up on stilts so that when it floods, there's really very little inconvenience. The water goes underneath. Problem solved. This is, I stole this off of a realty website from Sacramento, but this is the old style of house. When people moved into Sacramento, they built what was called Delta style homes. This is what they used to build in the Mississippi Delta, where they didn't just like steps because they thought steps were fun. They put their home about a story up above the flood plain so that the bottom floor would actually potentially be sacrificed in an emergency flood situation. And of course, now most people who have homes like this, they have offices or they rent out the bottom floor. They don't assume it's going to flood, but that's why these homes were like this originally. Here's, I just found a picture of this on a website, but here's a home that is in a floodplain. You can see in action. I don't know how you get to it. I guess you have to boat to it on that day, but at least all their belongings aren't flooded. Um, Old Town Sacramento, interestingly, way back when, over 100 years ago, they got so sick of flooding that one by one, they all decided to raise the roads and raise the buildings. So you see up here, they got these jacks and they jacked up buildings, an entire story. So they said, well, we're not going to move the city, but we're going to lift the city, which is a phenomenal thought. They did lift much of the original city of Sacramento. If anybody knows Old Sacramento, I think it's called Candy Heaven is over here, where they'll give you a free candy. I mean, I figure people know free candy. And actually, you can see the part of the city that is raised. So all this street right here is the new level of the city. All this parking lot is the old level of the city. So you can sometimes peek underneath and see parts of it. Here is, you can take a tour. It's kind of interesting, a historical tour of Sacramento, and you can go underneath and see evidence of some of this. And this is a map that shows how much of the city was raised. The tan color, so I don't know if you can see right here, the tan color is higher ground. And again, a lot of that was literally filled in and raised buildings. Same thing here. So we're not talking 2 or 3 buildings. We're talking 20 or 30 square blocks of the city. Yeah. So how are we unique? What do we do that's interesting? We have built what's called a series of bypasses. So if you think of your river here, and you think of these black lines as levees, we basically set aside huge areas to flood in an emergency. So I basically talk about the rivers, and then I talk about the emergency rivers. So we've got rivers, and then we've got emergency rivers that we can use when we need them. So here's the river. There's the emergency river. There's an example of using the emergency river when it's needed. This is a much larger area, so it shows different gates like this. All these little black arrows would be gates. All of this light blue shading would be the bypass, the emergency river, and then all the dark blue would be our rivers and streams. So we really we've altered the entire system to accommodate for flooding. I'm going to skip that one. So there's a gate right in this area here. Called the Sacramento Weir. That's the one that really protects our area, and they'll open the gate and they'll send a ton of water and it'll flood that whole area. So you notice how much bigger the emergency river is than the little river. So here's an aerial view. If anybody's ever driven Interstate 80, it goes over the river. IKEA is over here. A lot of people know IKEA. So here's the diversion, and here's a day where they're actually using it. So the water will spill out when it's needed, and sometimes, interestingly, it'll flow backward and spill out when it's needed. And that's a whole thing I don't have time to get into. But these gates are really important. It's a great way to divert water in an emergency. So here's I'm going to stand in the next picture. I'm standing by this tree right here. Okay, so here's a dry day. Here's a wet day. Okay, where the water's right up against the gates. There's a dry day. That's what it looks like on a wet day, okay? And then here's somebody opening the gates. They literally have to open them, and then the water spills out down these channels. So here's the channel. There's a dry day. There's a wet day. And again, that's kind of the last chance to divert water away from downtown Sacramento before, it reaches the Capitol. So this is where all the water's going out here. And you can see, giant farmland. Here's a normal dry day. Here's a little bit of water. Here's a lot of water. And what I like to tell people is that we have designed a system that can accommodate the entire flow of the Mississippi River, which is a crazy thought. The average flow of the Mississippi River can basically show up on our doorstep, and we have a place to put it, which is, as I said, a really kind of amazing thought. And in terms of the future, I'll just mention a few of these. Take care of the levees. We really should be spending money on them. Use Folsom Dam, and they've actually redesigned it so they leave it emptier when we need room for flood protection. They built it taller, and they built a new drain. So they actually built a new drain so that we could drain it faster, which is kind of seems like a simple thing, but they didn't used to be able to do that. So there's the drain right there. And we need to stop building in risky places. I mean, that's really kind of the thing is, here's a spot north of Sacramento where a levee broke, and sadly, 5 people perished when this levee broke. They rebuilt it, which is what they needed to do, and then they put in 12,000 new homes. Why would anybody do that? It does not seem logical to me, but again, there's a lot of different opinions that people have. Here is an area called the American Basin. This is now, well, it used to be called the American Basin. It's now called Natomas, the Natomas Basin, but nobody calls it a basin because they don't want to worry people about flooding. This now has lots and lots of homes, and we didn't have to make that decision. We could have left it set aside as what it used to be, which was a natural wetland. Infill development is just a term that means build in areas that we've already protected, build closer to the city. So in the case of Sacramento, a lot of people are saying if you have a big piece of open land, then find ways to build homes and businesses there rather than farther out away where you're going to have to worry more about flooding. All of this area is extremely well protected from flooding. And you can see here's the new Golden One Arena here, downtown Sacramento. Yeah, I'm looking at the time. So it looks like we have 5 minutes or more. And I'll leave you with that slide. And thank you for your time. And I'll go ahead and actually stop sharing. And I want to hear what questions people might have. Let me see what the chat says.
Mostly making comments about how close those photos of flooding were to where they live.
Yes. Absolutely. If people have questions or comments, keep them coming. I have one more thing I could show if people were curious to make a point about building and not building.
We have a
I was wondering, sorry.
Go ahead, Alice.
I was wondering again, I wrote it down, how much a levee costs per mile again?
It's over $1 million a mile to do it right.
Holy.
That's what I say.
So my daughter was asking this morning, after she buys a house, does she still have to like pay for stuff after she's paid off the house? And I'm like, well, there's this thing called property taxes. Like, what's that? Why would I pay that all the time? I'm like, well, levies. So if you want the government to help protect your house and pay for roads and stuff, you need to pay taxes on it.
Somebody says, how long have I been studying this? For probably 25 years. I find it to be such an important topic and such an interesting topic. If you're interested in geography, you've got people and you've got nature and you've got people and nature together. Yeah, I really think it's a big deal. Yeah, I hope they don't get rid of the wetlands. I mean, we really need to have those because they serve as farmland. They serve as natural wetland for birds, and they serve as our emergency river when we need it. So we probably won't get rid of that, Isaiah.
I was wondering, you said how many miles of levee do we have?
I should have an exact number. I don't, but you know, in our greater area, hundreds of miles of levee.
And how many of that is like well put and like
million a mile, Oscar.
Good.
Yeah. I would say since that map that I had shown you, they've done some work. Voters voted in some monies to spend because we need to do that. And, you know, I would say probably we still have 25 to 50% that we should be worried about. I mean, yeah, probably 25 to 50% that we should still be worried about. So we still have probably hundreds of millions of dollars worth of levies that we should be spending on.
Whose responsibility is it to figure out how to build the levees?
There's a number of different agencies that cooperate. So there's called the Army Corps of Engineers are often responsible for rivers that are navigable. So if you people take boats down them, they will have a role with that. Also, the Bureau of Reclamation is another agency that is originally that they were made a big deal about building levees so that we could reclaim farmland. That's why they called it the Bureau of Reclamation. So those are the two biggest agencies. And then there's different water projects who want to try to get water from one place to another. The state of California is involved in important water projects. The federal government is involved in important water projects that affect California. Yeah. Other comments or questions? I'm looking at the time. Looks like we're almost out of time here, I believe.
Well, we go until 12:05, so we
okay.
actually have a few more minutes if you wanted to share the other thing.
I do actually, yeah, because it's an interesting story of geography that's totally related to flooding and flood control. So let me put away my chat. Let me here. Okay, good. So this is, I believe, a product that was created through Google, but they call it Earth Engine Time Lapse. I've heard another similar website called timehop.com. And what it does is it takes the history of satellite images and it runs them like a little movie so you can see how the land has changed. So this area here is North Natomas. So if anybody, there's the Truxell interchange. There's lots of businesses and movie theaters and restaurants near the Truxell interchange. There is somewhere right out here is, I don't even remember, Sleep Train Arena, I guess, where the Kings used to play out here. But I can run this as a little movie and you'll see it kind of fill in with homes and more homes and more homes, which is, people build, people need places to live. But this is, if everything were to, well, if our levees were to catastrophically fail during a high flood event, this is one of the deepest spots in the entire area. It would fill up possibly over 20 feet deep of water. So that was my argument about it's not really a very wise place to consider putting homes, but what did we do? We decided, well, we think the levees are good enough, so we're going to put homes there. So I'm going to run the little movie, and I want you to look at, it's going to go from kind of this greenish tan to gray is what it's going to do over time. So start looking for it to fill in, especially here. You can see out here, you can see all this up here. Okay, so it'll repeat now. So you can see it, all of the building just marches northward. All of these neighborhoods and homes and businesses that weren't there 30 years prior. So when I mention this to people, especially a lot of my students live out here, they get a little bit freaked out. What we've done is we've now had to spend a ton of money, and we will continue to have to spend money and resources to continue to protect this area. If we had simply said, let's not do that, let's build our homes and businesses elsewhere, we could have left this to be set aside as a flood overflow area, and we could have left it as more needed farmland. We could have left it as wildlife habitat. But now it's homes and businesses, and we are forever and ever and ever into the future now responsible for maintaining those levees and spending money to protect this area. So I'm not saying we need to kick these people out. I'm just saying we've now created a responsibility for ourselves to have to protect this, when if we had done it differently in the first place, we wouldn't be in this situation. I'll run it one more time so you can kind of see. The main building was all of this, and then this along Interstate 5. This is, if people ever drive out toward the airport, you're seeing a lot of this. This is really a great tool for geographers to use to study what's called landscape change. How do landscapes change over time? So anyway, I just always thought it was a really interesting tool. Other questions that people might have. I will tell you that in Davis, for the most part, we are fairly well protected from flooding. We are generally on higher ground compared to other places. Um, they talk about, they use terms like 100-year flood or 50-year flood or 500-year flood. And I don't necessarily want to get into the mathematics of that, but if somebody says a 500-year flood, it's basically the level of water that we would only ever expect to see once in 500 years. So in terms of flood protection, that's actually pretty good. I don't want it to be the year that happens ever, but we have in the ballpark of 1 in 500-year flood protection in the Davis area. But I'll tell you, people in and around Davis have been dealing with floods for a long time. Poudre Creek, a lot of people have visited Poudre Creek. That used to be a much bigger problem than it is now. When is the last time we had one of those? Well, interestingly enough, every time we have a big flood, it alters the mathematics because now you have to factor in that it's happened. And so when was the last time we had a 500-year flood? We've easily had some 100-year floods. Like, I mean, the ironic thing is you can have two 100-year floods within the same decade. You can have them back to back. But in about 2017, I think it was, that winter, our bypass filled up. We had the Mississippi River visiting our doorstep, and it worked okay, but it was very stressful because that bypass was filled up for a long time, and the longer water sits there, the more pressure it pushes, and there were some leaky levees. I mean, it was pretty serious stuff. So I would say the last time we had a very serious flood that should really concern a lot of people was only about 3 years ago. And if a levee breaks, the question is, which side did it break on? Did it break on the side pointing away from Davis, or did it break on the Davis side? Well, fortunately, that time we didn't have a levee break. But there's stories of people historically who would blow up levees, but they'd blow it up on the other side so that the water would basically flood their neighbors. Yeah, I'm not suggesting that's a good thing to do, but there's all kinds of history behind this because it's a pretty high stakes game. Other comments or questions? Anybody feel like some of that was familiar? Anybody